My name is Dr. Chris Jenkins, and I am the CEO of the Orianne Society and the host of the Snake Talk podcast, the podcast where you learn about nature's most feared, maligned, and persecuted animals. I invite you to listen to this conversation, and maybe you'll find that what you perceive as fear is actually rooted in a deep fascination. Welcome to the Snake Talk podcast. I am here today with Michael Starkey, who is the founder and executive director of Save the Snakes. I'm excited about today's episode because, first of all, there's so few, of us nonprofits that are focused on reptiles and amphibians, and having, some level of communication and building bridges and partnership opportunities is just really exciting for me. And the other thing is that, despite being a snake person myself and Orianne Society working quite a bit on snakes, I know very little about this organization. So I'm going to be learning right along with all of you today. So welcome to the podcast, Michael. How are you doing today?
Well, first, thank you so much for having me here. I'm so excited to speak to the audience about snake conservation around the world. And yeah, doing very well. We're over here in Sacramento, California, having very nice weather, so I can't complain.
That sounds good. I've learned a while ago, because I've lived in a lot of really cold places, and now I live in Georgia, and I've learned that while you can't control the climate, you can control where you live. So I love living in places with nice weather. So, but anyways, I like to start the episodes to learning a little bit more about our guests. And I want to start right at the beginning for you. Obviously, we'll talk about it more, but you obviously have a really, big interest in snakes and conservation. And, I just want to hear the roots of where that all started. Were you young? Is it something that kind of hit you as an adult, somewhere in between? How did that all come about for you?
Yeah, I think many of us who work in this space with snakes all have some pretty interesting backgrounds, right? And so I think, but for many of us, it had to do with like a little snake crawling around our backyard, right? And just being absolutely fascinated by it. So I actually grew up here in Sacramento, and I was kind of a city kid though, like where my access to nature was pretty minimal. And so like I remember growing up in basically like a housing development, like suburban, total suburbanite. And then they're, creating all these new homes, and like this little gopher snake was like found on the street, and me and these other neighbor kids are like gathered around it, just staring at this snake, being so fascinated by it. And then all the the parents discover that we have a snake, and then they end up killing it because they think it's a rattlesnake. And to me, it's one of my first snake experiences as a kid, being so fascinated by this animal that, was fleeing, habitat destruction. Right. But then kind of like then having the unfortunate side effect of people who are trying to do the right thing, but maybe not for the snake's interest. And so that instance, and then just going to zoos as a child, and then eventually keeping snakes as pets, so much that actually I was kind of a product of the pet trade, where I was actually keeping and breeding a lot of snakes, just really becoming fascinated by them. But it wasn't until basically about 18, 19, I kind of had a big change of thought with how I was keeping animals. And it partly had to do with my first job as a scientific technician working for a biologist who was studying giant garter snakes. And so for those who don't know, the giant garter snake is actually the largest garter snake in the world, and it only lives in the Central Valley of California. And we were actually tracking how far that these snakes would move. The snakes had transmitters, and we were seeing how they used water, how far they would travel from water. And, these snakes were moving good distances. And then I would go home and take care of my snakes and racks and sweater boxes. And I had a big change mentally about it. And all I knew, though, is that I wanted to find any opportunity I could to work with snakes in the wild.
So was that change, so you're seeing these animals really moving in the wild, but then you realized you have all of these snakes, and, for most of your life, the perspective of a snake is just kind of in a vacuum or in a rack system, if you will.
Well, it was interesting because, I was a kid growing up in the 90s. So I was also heavily influenced by like TV, right? So Steve Irwin, I remember Jeff Corwin in the early days and Wild Discovery and like Animal Planet and stuff. And so I had this fascination with snakes in the wild already as a kid growing up, but there was no way to see them because I didn't grow up with much means. And so my parents, weren't taking me to Costa Rica or anything like that to see snakes. And so I kind of would just learn about a snake and then find a way to get it and keep it in my house. So I had like a lot of boa constrictors, right? And so it was always just this interesting process of growing up, kind of like being exposed to snakes as the development of the internet. I mean, this might seem kind of strange, but it makes sense if you don't have a strong connection to or access to nature, but you find nature in other means. So like, like the internet and TV and things like that. It kind of gets you to the same area of wanting to help snakes in the wild or learn about snakes in the wild. There's a nature deficit disorder already in our society, at least in North America, with people really losing access to nature and environmental education. And so for me, it was like a strong craving to just get to know about snakes. But it came down to, well, I can't go see them in the wild based on where I lived. And so I kind of just ended up collecting them. But then I still wanted to work with them and become a herpetologist. I knew from early on I wanted to work with wildlife as a career. And so I pestered this poor snake biologist when I was in high school, a senior in high school. And then eventually, right when I graduated, he gave me a job. And that job working with that snake, the giant garter snake, changed my life. Mm-hmm. It set me on a career of working with consulting biologists, getting jobs, working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, California Department of Fish and Game. And I didn't always work with snakes. While snakes were always number one, and I think many can definitely, sympathize with this feeling. It's like you just want to be around snakes all day, but you have to have a day job. And some of us in biology also may not get to work with snakes. So I was working with Chinook salmon, doing escapement surveys. I was doing small mammal research in the Sierra Nevada mountains. I was banding birds. Any opportunity I could to work with wildlife was kind of like, it was adjacent to snakes, because wherever I was out in a nature area, I'd go out and find snakes whenever I had time off. And also I did a lot of seasonal work. So I would work, summers on giant garter snake research, and in the winter I'd be working amphibian work. And so, in your neck of the woods, amphibians are actually really happy during the summer, but all our amphibians go away in California. They're like, oh, it's too hot, right? So the winter time is when you can find, or work with these really amazing amphibians like our California red-legged frogs and California tiger salamanders. And so by the time I was 23, I had a long resume working with many different species in California. And snakes were always kind of on the sidelines, but it was having those experiences that were really important to me that made me think about, how can I get a job working with snakes, right? And it's difficult. And so especially for people who are pursuing a career in herpetology, I really recommend that people do try and work in other areas. So it's like get into ornithology or, do spend a summer working with fish, because it expands your horizons. And you may actually come back to snakes or wherever you want to come back, but it's by expanding kind of your resume, it actually can be a good thing for your career in the long run.
Yeah, I always kind of recommend the same thing too, even within, say, wildlife biology. You can get different specializations, whether that's, a focus on disease or a focus on, GIS and spatial analysis, and that can always help people's careers. But going back to your origin story where, this gopher snake that that you saw get killed. I think I might have said it on the podcast before, but that phenomenon has always amazed me, and I've seen it multiple times because, as I'm sure you do, I give a lot of outreach presentations, like in person, where you have live snakes and you're talking to groups, and there's been multiple times where I'm have a child in front of me, and I'm holding a snake and they're holding the snake, and their parents come rushing up and tell them, "Oh my God, put that thing down." And so it's interesting to think about how some of these things can be passed down through the generations. But so you're keeping snakes as kind of your way to connect with them, because you can't you're a city kid, as you mentioned, and then but then you also know you want to get into wildlife biology, and you did that by really basically pestering. Did you say pestering? You used a word like that, but a local biologist.
Yeah.
I'm assuming was that Brian out of the Dixon Center there? Brian Halstead?
No, it was a different consulting biologist. So it wasn't with USGS. It was actually with a private consultant.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Great.
But that's kind of how I found my opportunities was, who's working with the species I want to work with. And, writing them an email. Right. And I think we have a lot of volunteers that save the snakes, and sometimes they seem so terrified to talk to people that they're interested in. I bet many of them would be terrified to talk to you because you're a big name, right? Or like Emily Taylor, these other big names, right?
Yeah.
And I'm just like, they're people too. Just send them an email. Yeah, but it is true, because even within our little world, we get like that sometimes. But that was my way of thinking. If I found a researcher who was working with tiger salamanders, or I would write them an email and say, hey, do you need volunteers? And that's kind of how I started getting opportunities. And I started just trying, in my early 20s, I was really, ironically, a really bad student, but trying to work as much as possible to have these really amazing research opportunities, or just technician jobs, things like that, working with cool wildlife and cool places. And it kind of led to some really incredible opportunities, because it turned into, I kind of want to explore a little bit outside and go see some other places. And so one of my first international experiences was living in Panama for 3 months. I got a job with a doctorate student who was studying larval development of frogs and maternal care in this one frog called Leptodactylus insularum out of the Smithsonian Research Institute in Panama. I was 20 years old. I mean, just green, but I'd done some technician work and done some CTS work. And I just wanted to go see snakes in the jungle. That sounded like a really good time. But if I have to go stare at tadpoles all day, I'll do it. But that job changed my life. Mm-hmm. And the ability to go way outside of your comfort zone and to pour yourself into an experience, and also just to be in an environment with people who are getting their PhDs, or, that was the area where a lot of the amphibian declines were being studied in Panama. So this is back in 2008. So this is the golden toad in Costa Rica is already extinct, but there's all these Atelopus species in the mountains where I was that were going extinct. And just to be on the forefront of chytrid research. Anyway, not snakes, but again, an experience that really shaped my understanding of extinctions, and, how I remember visiting this center that was basically trying to catch as many amphibians in some of these high mountain areas that are getting wiped by chytrid. And the El Valle Amphibian Conservation Center, the name just came to me. But I remember seeing this one salamander, and it was the last one that they could find. And just, that's it. That's the one, you know? So and to me, that was yeah. And so when I came back from an experience like that, wanting to spend as much time in the jungle, but then also wanting to do more. And, how can we save wildlife? And especially, thinking about animals like snakes. I mean, fear of snakes is such a thing. And we can mobilize people to save frogs, maybe. Like
Maybe
frogs are a little more
turtles,
charismatic, but what
maybe.
about snakes?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, and as I'm
Yeah.
sure you know, being down there, we did a whole episode on it here on the podcast. But those amphibian declines you were studying were followed by a wave of snake declines right behind them, as
Yeah.
the food base for some of these species disappeared. But so kind of going back to your trajectory, so you're keeping snakes, you start doing these seasonal jobs, and I'll just highlight. I've probably said it before on the podcast, but anybody who wants to make it in the field of working really with any wildlife in studying ecology, conservation biology, anything kind of working in the wild with animals, it's an incredibly hard thing to make it at because so many people want to do it. And so that
Yeah.
is one of the trajectories people can take, is to work a lot of seasonal jobs and just build networks and build experience and kind of work your way up. It's also a pretty hard lifestyle in some ways, depending on what things you need in your life. If you need a lot of money and things like that, that's typically not going to happen with those jobs. But so I'm curious, did you end up, so you were working these seasonal jobs. Did you ever end up, and you did that right from high school. So did you ever end up going to,
Yeah.
college or university, or did you just kind of start working right away into this field?
Yeah. So I was really fortunate that I was working basically right out of high school. And so in that job working with giant garter snakes, so here in California, we have the most environmental regulations of any state. And a lot of our threatened and endangered species, if you get like any experience working with them, that's like an amazing thing to have on your resume. And so working with that species, and then I hopped on a winter job working with California tiger salamanders. And it was like, so by the time I'm like, halfway through being 20 years old, like I've gone to Panama and I've worked with these two imperiled species. And so it was just easier to get jobs after that. But at the same time, I'm trying to go to community college and struggling so much. School was really difficult for me, even when I was in elementary school and high school. And I was almost a high school dropout. Like that's probably for a different podcast. But just had some tough times. And so I found a lot of, happiness in working with wildlife. And so, but sitting in a classroom, for 2.5 hours and trying to understand organic chemistry, it was tough. And so what I found though, is that I kind of kept working these seasonal jobs, going to community college. And so I just really, really staggered out my education, because also like you mentioned too, working seasonal jobs is not very lucrative. Right. And so it's kind of like being poor, saving up as much money as possible, struggling in school, working a cool summer, cool winter job, and then trying to find any excuse I could to go travel to Central or South America.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously at that time I could not have snakes due to that lifestyle. And so kind of shied away from keeping snakes and found them all good homes.
Well, that story's, I want to get to where you actually work day to day now, but then also obviously get into the save the snakes here. But it's a pretty amazing story in that you've made it in this field, doing it that way. Because most people will end up, they'll go get an undergraduate degree in zoology or forestry or wildlife biology, whatever it might be. And then they start that grind of all the seasonal work. So being able to come out of high school and have that dedication and be able to do that over time, that's pretty amazing. So you're doing all of this seasonal work on a whole variety of species, and then where did you? I want to say you work for an environmental consultant today. Is that correct or no?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So how did that?
And I actually have my
happen?
own company.
Okay.
Yeah. So as of today, I actually started my own consulting company where it's basically just me. I consult on snake and amphibian, well, basically, if you need to work with an imperiled reptile amphibian species in California, I can help with that, right? And the work that I do with Save the Snakes is I I can't call it a hobby because of how much blood, sweat, and tears I put into this organization, but it's a labor of love. And Save the Snakes does not pay me. I do not take a salary from Save the Snakes. But to get to the point of a consulting firm, or starting my own company, I had to make some tough decisions. And so when I was younger, I was working for consultants, but I also worked for, our agencies, so Fish and Wildlife Service and California Department of Fish and Game. And I worked with biologists there and I saw their careers. And I did not want to be a career agency biologist. Especially during the time that I was working for like the Department of Fish and Wildlife, so California's agency. I mean, they were going under budget cuts. They had, it was this time in California's political history where they were like basically not paying state employees. And it was just like that. I don't want to do that. But then there was also this big push because of the work that I did in Panama, and I started doing some other work in Belize too. So I started doing some bat things in Belize. So helping researchers, miss net for bats. I did some bat work in Mexico. If I was going to work with a non-reptile, it would be bats. Bats are definitely another species I'm very passionate about. But they have enough support. Everyone loves bats. So snakes need more help.
Yep.
But so kind of at the same time, there was this interest in maybe doing a PhD. And so I was working with some researchers that were studying amphibian and bat like relationships, so frogs making calls that actually kind of like basically disrupt bats' echolocation so that they can't find them, and really kind of cool subjects and questions that need to be answered. But I looked at academics who are, just like this whole publisher perish model was not for me either. And it was really interesting, but because I started in school and the academia part of me just wasn't there. But it wasn't until I actually worked for a nonprofit in my early 20s, like maybe mid 20s, doing frog conservation work. And that was a game changer because I have this inherent desire to want to do good in the world. Like I want to be net positive, if that makes sense, right? Because I can't help but see so much negative in the world. And I've kind of so my way of dealing with all the negativity, all the terrible things that happen in the world is just, I want to be a force for good. And that might seem a little cheesy, but it is just like the way that I live my life, right? And so the working for a nonprofit was really interesting in that just the idea of not, that's just what you do, is just you're trying to save amphibians or, educate people about nature and wildlife. And I became really interested in that. And so I did that work for a long time, and that brought me to some really cool places. So for example, with that nonprofit organization, we had a program in Ghana in West Africa that was trying to reduce the trade of amphibians for food in certain northern Ghanaian communities. And so working with Ghanaian biologists and understanding, okay, why are people relying on this source of food, and it didn't need to happen, or it was something it was kind of a new thing that was as a food item, and trying to understand how can we save wildlife without basically disrupting communities' ways of life, and involving the communities to actually save wildlife and understand problems that are happening in other parts of the world. And so that kind of opened up this whole other world of wildlife conservation, and how wildlife conservationists are helping people to coexist with wildlife. Whether people are over harvesting a species or using the forest in unsustainable ways. And so working for this frog organization, we were able to help some of those issues. And that actually kind of created the template for Save the Snakes. So being involved in international amphibian conservation, I was like, well, there really isn't anything like that for snake conservation. And so I wanted to explore that more. And, and it wasn't until many years later that Save the Snakes was started. Interesting though, to be able to kind of travel to some wonderful parts of the world and meet amphibian biologists doing great work and help them kind of from the U.S. side.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's stick with that and save the snakes. And so like I said, I know very little about the organization, so I'm excited to learn more. I mean, if I'll tell you basically my perspective of what you guys do, knowing almost nothing, then you can correct me throughout the rest of this conversation. But, I view your organization as very linked to people in that, you do a lot of kind of education outreach and training and working with communities, both here in North America as well as, beyond, and that you also plug in to kind of on the ground conservation projects that might be research or other things, and work with folks, primarily by giving out grants. But again, I may have that wrong. But that's kind of how I envision the organization. But before we get into that, I want you to lay out the structure of your programs and what you guys do. But I'd like to start at the beginning, and so you said you went on this, you were working for this nonprofit and you were doing these kind of community conservation related projects with frogs, which was kind of some of the idea behind Save the Snake. So what was it that finally made you take that jump and say, I'm going to create an organization to do this? And what were kind of those first initial steps? How did you, just saying I want to, not everybody, but a lot of people say I want to create a nonprofit for this or that, but creating one is a much different thing. As I know I've created one as well, or multiple really. But so just kind of tell me about the very beginning. What was it that caused you to jump, and what did you do as those first steps in taking that jump? Snakes are one of the most persecuted groups of animals in the world, but we are dedicated to changing that. If you like what we've been discussing here on the Snake Talk podcast, here's an opportunity to turn that inspiration into action. Head over to www.orian.org and explore how you can support the Orian Society. Click on Take Action on our menu to make a difference.
So it really comes back to it's a culmination of my personal and professional history that made me want to start Save the Snakes, because I love these animals, and that is maybe even an understatement of how much I'm passionate about snakes. I think that snakes are, just such elegant, mysterious creatures. But man, they have a bad rap, right? And I think everyone listening to this podcast is going to agree to that. But there weren't groups out there that I felt were focusing on the key issue with snakes is that the majority of our population on this planet hates them. And I think that's an undeniable fact. And I saw this personally. So growing up, right, that little gopher snake got killed, but seeing many snakes get killed by farmers and ranchers and, even other biologists that are just like, oh, there's a rattlesnake in my salamander, my pitfall trap, okay, I got to deal with that. But then, you think about let me back up and give myself a little pause there. It was also working with this nonprofit that I was introduced to other wildlife conservation projects. And so we started kind of bringing ourselves to learn from other groups, because with conservation, I mean, it doesn't make sense to recreate the wheel unless, you have a difficult problem to solve. But conservation is generally, whether you're saving, whales, you're saving, salamanders to snakes. I mean, you're kind of using some of the same tools, because conservation it's about the wildlife and saving the wildlife, but it's connecting the people to the wildlife that live around that wildlife, right? So, it doesn't make sense for me, for example, to go all the way to Nepal and tell people in Nepal, hey, you should stop killing snakes. Absolutely not, right? So we need to be having people from those communities, value their wildlife, and many already do and are already saving that wildlife, but they might need a little bit of support. And so in my professional experience, I was seeing that, whether it was people in Ghana that were, trying to solve their issues that were impacting their lives, so lack of food and clean water and things like that, but if they had a snake that was in their area, well, they're going to protect their livestock, protect their family, to protect their the pets or anything like that. I kind of saw that sentiment wherever I traveled. So I spent a lot of time in Central America. So I actually lived in Belize for about 2.5 years. Part of my work there was reintroducing black howler monkeys into a new section of the rainforest, and working with a community that lived in that rainforest. And we're out tracking monkeys all day, but then a furtilance crosses their path, and there's this inclination to go and kill it, right? And so we're saving one group of wildlife, right? So whether I'm saving frogs or I'm saving howler monkeys, but snakes are always still getting a bad rap. And I thought that was really interesting, because if there's always this negative perception about snakes, it's like the number one barrier to their conservation. Like if you have people that cannot tolerate snakes being around them, because of ignorance, fear, whatever, there's no way. And we've seen this with some snake conservation projects, right? Where literally public perceptions shut down projects. And so what we want to do with Save the Snakes is kind of like honor that like people really have a problem with snakes, but people have a problem coexisting with the wildlife that lives in their backyard. But it is possible. And our organization set out to provide people with the tools. But it isn't always us that gives people the tools, right? It's our conservation partners. So people in Nepal, in Ecuador, and other places that are already working to help snakes, or solve that problem between human snake conflict, helping to support those individuals so they can do their jobs better. And that support really comes in many ways, but it initially just started with this premise of like, yeah, humans and snakes have this very long, painful history, but times are changing and people do want to coexist with wildlife. And I think that Save the Snakes is helping transition our society, not here just in California, but in other parts of the world, through kind of our, whether it's our staff or our conservation partners, to make the world a little bit more snake friendly. And those are some of our goals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen the same thing. One point you made there about biologists. I've spent a lot of time with people who are some of the most dedicated conservationists on the planet, whether they're biologists or philanthropists, and say they're really into birds and plants, who are absolutely terrified of snakes, who would potentially kill a snake just like anybody else. Or I say anybody else, but a large percentage of humans on the planet. So it's kind of fascinating. Like even within the small percentage of people on the planet that are really dedicated to conservation, there's a percentage of them that are still kind of anti-snake. So that is a point well taken. But I come back to my original question. I think that's good background. But so what was it? So you're seeing all this need for this to have this for snakes based on everybody's perception, and so snakes having a voice and building an entity that can kind of, I guess, empower some of the local people to start building outreach and knowledge and all of that around snakes. But is that what finally caused you to jump and start this, or what was that? What was that moment where you're like, I'm creating a nonprofit?
Yeah. So maybe I wish it was like that, but maybe not, because I think that's just all that's what encapsulates the organization, and that is some of the bigger reasons behind it. But I mean, that's kind of an idea, right? It's just like, well, we want humans and snakes to coexist, but how do you put that in action? And so when we first started in 2017, there was another organization that we basically was our first pilot Save the Snakes project in South India. And that whole program was trying to save king cobras in Vishakhapatnam. And the idea is that Save the Snakes is going to start a nonprofit in the United States so that we can better raise money, gather support, and, kind of create a team of experts and, uh, others that can help support this little organization on the ground so that they can basically just do the work. So they don't have to worry about raising money. They don't have to worry about writing grants. They don't have to worry about, posting on social media and gathering, donors to follow our cause. The idea was to kind of use this like nonprofit model to support this international snake conservation project. And so we did that, and we rushed to do it because also in 2017 is when the World Health Organization declared snakebite a neglected tropical disease. And the reason that's relevant is because as we were working to support a project in a country of India, so India has about 50,000 snakebite deaths per year, and those are probably low numbers. And we're starting a project or supporting a project that's going to, work with an animal that kills a lot of people. And then you have the World Health Organization that's saying that they cause, death and morbidity. We wanted to put a positive message out there about snakes. And so while we're supporting this little organization to do their work, we're also going to have the messaging behind it. And so we kind of were like bolstering our communications using social media, newsletters and things like that to counter the narrative that, because what do you do with disease vectors, right? What are people doing with malaria? They're trying to eradicate mosquitoes and other very, it's not very pro wildlife. I'm not going to say we need to save the mosquitoes, but it's a very anti-wildlife thing to do when you start eradicating species. And so if this idea of like, okay, we would need to reduce snake bite, then why don't we just eradicate snakes? And we wanted to be a counter to that perspective that literally could have been one of the measures to reducing snake bites was to eradicate snakes. And so very happy that now much of the messaging around snakebite is coexistence with snakes, understanding snakes. And I do like to think that we had a small part to play in that, at least with some of our messaging. But so this idea is that in the US, we can work to support these really dedicated conservationists around the world. And, first in India, but that first year when we got started, we put up SaveTheSnakes.org, got our social media going. We started getting calls from around the world where people, had a snake project in Mexico. They had one in Nepal. They had, some in West Africa. And we quickly realized that, maybe there's a lot of people out there that are saving snakes, but they need a little bit of support. And so we started a grant program. And this is, we were a really small organization. We had no money when we started, and we were literally hawking T-shirts at events. Just selling shirts, trying to put beautiful designs on shirts with snakes, going to reptile expos, going to nature festivals. And eventually we would raise enough so that we could start distributing grants. And we're very fortunate to have a pretty dedicated scientific advisory committee so they can make sure that the funds that we are sending out are going to, really incredible projects that are going to have a lasting, I guess outputs, I'd say, so that the money is not going to just, fizzle out and go to nowhere. Because we consider the grants that we send out to be seed grants, because Save the Snakes is not a large organization. We actually, believe it or not, have a relatively small budget. And so with that, we're not able to keep a project afloat very well just because there's not enough resources. And so as our organization grows, we aim to do that. But currently, what we can do is help an organization internationally get off the ground, and then, or, with their project, or for other ways that we support conservationists is we send people to conferences, present their research, helping these dynamic people to be able to better do their work. And then if they do want to keep their project going, we find creative ways to get funding. So Save the Snakes and our donors may not be the funder, but we might find a like-minded zoo in the United States. And so we act as a pass-through organization. Because that's a big thing, too, that many people may not realize, is that some of these international wildlife organizations, if they're some countries cannot get money from nonprofits in the U.S. For Nepal, we have a program that we support in Nepal. And so that was an example of a country that was sort of, for a time, blacklisted from some funding in the US because there was a concern that money wouldn't be spent well. And so what we can do is we distribute money to the conservation partners after receiving it from a US, foundation or other larger nonprofit with the means.
Yeah, I mean, the other
So
part
this
of
that
that
way
is,
of
I was just going to say the other part of that, and we do this as well, is, if let's just say there's somebody here in the United States that wants to donate towards, say, this King Cobra project, they can't donate to the nonprofit in India and get their tax benefits. So it's important to have nonprofits that work with those organizations. So people here in the U.S. that have the capacity or philanthropists, they can donate to a nonprofit, and then that nonprofit can get the money internationally, and that donor can get their
yeah,
tax benefits. It's an important role.
exactly. Getting where it's desperately needed. And so we really rely on a lot of small donations too. So, when, for example, it's when someone buys a t-shirt or they send us $5, I mean, that goes a long way. And, just to give you an example, so, Save the Snakes, we support a snake festival in Mexico, and that, we're sending them about $1,000 every year, and they're able to take that money and they organize events in almost every state in Mexico about snake education around World Snake Day. And to me, like $1,000 is just like nothing in the United States, but for some other projects, they're really able to stretch it further. And I think that's a really powerful way that if someone cares about snake conservation, their dollar can really be spread and make a very important impact in another part of the world.
Yeah. So I want to get on to some of the outreach work you do. But first of all, so it started almost somewhat opportunistically, somewhat out of need, but you had this connection to this project in India, and then the floodgates were opened. And so, how do you, as an organization, you said you have a scientific advisory board, but how do you decide where you work? Do you have like strategic priorities, say like 5 places, whatever it might be, India, South Africa, say 5 or 6 different kind of place-based priorities, or do you just work globally with these partners, and you kind of solicit potential projects, and people come to you, and then how would you decide where who you're going to work with, what projects you're going to work on, that whole side of things?
Yeah. So we have a kind of a core group of conservation partners that we support every single year. So when someone donates to Save the Snakes, and they like, oh, we really like your project in South Africa. Okay, so we direct those funds there. And so this project in South Africa it's heavily snakebite related, but it's also a really important geographic region too, because it's sort of a hub of other African conservation projects that we support through our grant program. And so we actually have a staff member in South Africa. She's working on her PhD on human snake conflict, and she is very much entrenched in the snakebite community. So that program out of South Africa is very relevant to a lot of the snakebite work that we do and support. But then we also have non-snake bite related projects that we support. And, snake bite is so important because human snake conflict, but unfortunately there's not a lot of money in that. And that sounds very terrible for what I just said, but it's true. No one wants to fund snake bite work that is relieving the burden of snake bite on communities around the world. It is, yeah, it's actually a global problem right now. And so we're still trying to focus on that, trying to see how we can better support projects that are working to reduce snakebite on the community level. And so, because that's our aim, is that most of our conservationists that we support are biologists, are people that are working in the field that understand snakes. And that is our niche. By understanding the ecology of snakes, how snakes use a landscape, how they interact with humans and human landscapes, that's where we reduce the conflict. So we're not concerned with anti-venom production. We're not concerned with, the research of anti-venom. It's at the community level, helping people reduce that burden, basically to prevent snake bite.
Mm-hmm.
But
And
so besides that snake,
do you work on the
sorry, go ahead.
treatment side? I mean, you said you don't work on, say, antivenom development, but obviously preventing snake bite, things that you might do. It sounds like you guys are doing to help prevent or lower the rate of snake bites, but also
Mhm.
working to improve treatment. Not necessarily by, again, researching antivenom, but resources so these communities can better treat snake bite. Those types of things, what you're talking about in the treatment side. I mean, those would go, huge strides towards conserving snakes. Do you guys work on that front too, like increasing capacity to treat snake bite?
Yeah, that's actually another segue. So one of our other conservation partners in Nepal. So when we started supporting him in 2018, it was actually our first other country that we started working in. Basically, he was creating like snakebite centers, like education centers in Western Nepal. And the whole point was to just basically get community members throughout this very agricultural area to learn more about snakes, but then to also know what to do when a snake bite would occur. And so what we saw though is that these snake bite centers were paired with a local hospital that was actually treating snake bite the right way and had great doctors who would treat it. And so we saw by conducting these education programs that the hospital saw more snake bite cases. And so by giving people the right information, because if some who are listening are kind of confused, it's like, yeah, you think if you're bitten by a snake, you would go to a hospital. In other parts of the world, there are many traditional beliefs where you may not go to a hospital for many reasons. It could be financial, it could be distance to get to the hospital, but also traditional beliefs where the Western medicine actually may make the snake bite worse, and so they may work with a traditional healer and do a different form of treatment for the snake bite. But antivenom is the only thing that will treat a snake bite. And so that conservation in Nepal was basically getting all these people desensitized to snakes to understand, okay, if I'm bitten, this is what I need to do. I need to go to the hospital. And so the treatment of snake bite is important, but we're trying to facilitate people just to get to the place. And then making sure that the hospital has doctors that we know as well that are treating it the right way, right? Because that is such a big issue with treatment. But what's interesting about that project is by kind of laying this groundwork of, human snake conflict and, snake bite, but lots of education about snakes and just reaching thousands and thousands of people. Now these people call this conservationist if there's a snake. And so they have a team of snake rescuers who go out and literally take snakes away from people's homes. But it's opened the doors for us to finally start conducting king cobra conservation efforts. Because if we had started with this, like, okay, king cobras are a globally threatened species. Nepal, they have many conservation issues threatening them. But if we started just going into these communities and saying, oh, you guys need to save king cobras. No. It has taken 5 years to get to this point where now you have communities that trust the conservationists and their team to say, okay, you snake people, I found a king cobra. I'm not going to kill it. I'm going to keep an eye on it, and you can come and get it. And it's helping to map the distribution of king cobras in Nepal. And this is how we get to snake conservation, right? So we have to tackle snake bite. We have to make sure that there are resources available for people to even just to know that if a snake bite happens, like, they know what to do, right? Because you can't think about saving some endangered snake if you have to deal with like people in your family who are literally dying from snake bite. And so Nepal is one of these programs that we support. We've been supporting since 2018, and we're just seeing incredible things come out of those programs.
So you've talked about with my kind of strategy question, everybody has limited resources. How do you strategize how to best use them? You talked about you have these core projects that you kind of support year to year. But then it sounds like there was going to be a second part to that other projects, like, just say I'm in Paraguay and I contact you and, hey, we've got this going on. I mean, is there an avenue for those types of projects too, or is it the long-term projects that you guys focus on? Whether you're passionate about preserving biodiversity, ensuring the survival of threatened species, or simply want to contribute to a healthier planet, there's a role for you. Your support isn't just a contribution, it's an investment in a future where our ecosystems thrive. Go to www.orian.org to donate or become a member today.
When we started Save the Snakes again, like we really did get so many calls for support. And so what we did is we opened up this grant program, and it's called the Save the Snake Support Grant. And it basically was like, if you're working on a snake conservation project or a human snake conflict project, send us, here's the details, send us a proposal. But specifically, we wanted to support, when we think about strategy, projects that are focusing on IUCN threatened or endangered species, or species that are maybe not listed and should be a endangered species, or snakebite projects that are in like Latin America, and it used to be West Africa, but we've kind of broadened it to the continent of Africa, and then Southeast Asia. And so we're really trying to focus in these areas. So Africa, kind of like the Central and Northern South America, and then Southeast Asia, because these areas, not only do they have many endangered snakes, but they also have some very alarming snakebite rates. Yeah. And so the idea is that we're soliciting proposals from people who, might be working on like an endangered snake or these snakebite projects, because we want to know who's out there doing this work. And we know that, from our lens in the United States, it's like we can't keep tabs on everything that's happening in the world, but we want to support, important work if it's being done out there. And so that's our way to kind of see what's happening too, by offering these little seed grants. And again, sometimes these seed grants, they might be about $1,000, maybe a little bit more, maybe less. And they'll just be to fund an event. That's a snake education event that might be for, like a group of, it could be like for a local community. It could be through a university, something like that. Or it might be like a targeted conservation program for an endangered snake species. So to date, since 2017, Save the Snakes has supported 33 projects in 19 countries. And most of those are these seed grants, right? And we've expanded this grant program we actually now have a very specific Southeast Asian grant scheme. We still have our support grants. And then we now have a grant program that's for the Western United States. And also, it's called the Pacific States Grant, which is actually focusing for BC and Canada down to Baja, Mexico, and looking at endangered or maybe species that are actually like species of special concern, or that might need a little bit more support.
Okay. Well, so I think that does a pretty good job of covering, especially what you do internationally. But it also looks like, again, in the little information that I have, that you guys do a lot of very direct work, community building outreach as well. I mean, you're sitting in, I believe, what you guys call the Snake Conservation Center, where you have a live animal collection and facilities for events. I know you have a big annual festival that I think just passed, and you do trainings and all of that. So talk a little bit about that side of the nonprofit and how you're working more domestically or here in the U.S., or maybe that's beyond as well. But talk about that real direct approach to conservation that you guys are using, where you're directly educating, training, all of that.
Well, so I like to think that most of the work we do is international, but there was a time that we had to make a very drastic change, and that change was the pandemic. And so when the pandemic happened, people stopped donating. And that was basically conducting events, public events, and like selling merchandise and receiving donations was our only form of revenue for our organization. And so it quickly became clear that we had to kind of diversify our revenue streams. And at that time, we didn't have a collection of snakes. We were just kind of promoting our international work that we were supporting. And so what we ended up doing is finding some creative ways that we could, not only gain additional revenue, but even kind of solve some of our snake problems at home. And so many of the programs that we support internationally they're human snake conflict mitigation. So trying to work with the community, having individuals, conservationists from that community, like empower them as much as we can to help solve snake problems, right? So help that community, overcome their fears and misunderstandings. And man, there's a lot of that in Northern California. So we don't have, king cobras or, crazy vipers here, but we do have our Northern Pacific rattlesnake. And there are a lot of conflicts that happen. So California is an incredible agricultural state. And so we have, vineyards and other places where snakes are occurring. And so some of our programs in California, not only having the Snake Conservation Center, which houses, a collection of about 24 ambassador animals, venomous and non-venomous, but it also serves as a place that we can hold trainings. And so we partner with the Rattlesnake Conservancy to offer the same curriculum that they developed, 5 or 6 years ago, 7 years ago, because we actually really value that curriculum because of how safe it is. And so, as working with venomous snakes is inherently dangerous. Our organization strives to be a role model for how to be safe and sane when working with snakes. We do have a large communications component of our organization, so going online and talking about snakes and things like that. And if anyone spends any time on social media and YouTube, TikTok, and they see people interacting with rattlesnakes, it's bad. It's really bad. And we want to be the complete opposite of that. And there are people and organizations and companies and landowners that they don't want showboatmanship and things like that with working with snakes. They want to solve the problem. And so offering the Rattlesnakes Conservancy here in California has allowed us to, go to a vineyard and train their staff how to safely, relocate a snake that is in their work area. And so that aims to keep snakes safe, but it also helps empower their team to be able to, keep themselves safe. And so that training has radically changed our organization. And so by offering that, it's an additional revenue stream. We were able to operate in the later part of the pandemic, have more funds. And so when people take those training courses and it's a fee for service program, that directly supports our international work. And so, but then we also we developed this collection of ambassador animals and started getting volunteers that wanted to do more and more events. And so every year in Northern California, we do between 30 and 40 public events, and those reach 20 to 30,000 people that will learn about snakes, be educated about snakes. And one of those events is a fun event called the Sacramento Snake Festival, which is going on 3 years now. And it's a very simple nature festival that celebrates snakes. And so we have it at a local park, and it's in an area where there's a high concentration of Northern Pacific rattlesnakes. So it's combined as a snake safety event. And the idea is just get our community, families, and others to be interested about snakes, but also to learn about, maybe instead of getting the shovel, I'll go call Save the Snakes and get it rescued instead. And so this combination of having highly focused work here has been able to grow the organization because we've not only diversified our revenue, but we've grown more supporters. We have more volunteers that want to help us. They want to help the international work. So a perfect example is we're actually developing an internship program for South Africa, so that people in the United States, if they're a student at Sacramento State University or any university, they can go and work on a snake project in South Africa. And so that would be working to help our conservation partner to actually educate people about snakes, get some venomous snake training too, which working with rattlesnakes is one thing, but working with black mambas is another. And so being very safe and professional about that as well. But it's just another way to combine opportunities and resources for our community here in California to connect them to our global programs and projects. And so, yeah.
Great. I love it. So if anybody who's listening to this wanted to go and support your mission, I mean, obviously there are these events and festivals that you've talked about where they can go and purchase T-shirts. Is there a way they can purchase these T-shirts online? Is there a way they can donate if somebody has a particular interest, say they're interested in the project in Nepal or something in South America? Is there a way they can give to particular projects? Talk a little bit about that. How can people support the work that you guys are doing and help to save snakes?
We're so grateful for a community of donors that supports us today. And so one beautiful thing out of the pandemic is that there was a kind of a showering of support as we re-entered civilization, right? And we do have some, wonderful supporters, and we're grateful for all of them. But we are a grassroots organization, and many people that support us, it's $5, $10, and that propels our work. And so if you visit savethesnakes.org, savethesnakes.org, you can learn more about the work that we do, see some of the projects. You can donate if you're able, or you can pick up one of our t-shirts. So I'm very proud that we work with some really talented artists that contribute their skills to make beautiful snake art, because we do want to celebrate snakes. Our kind of whole ethos is that like people don't need to love snakes, they don't need to appreciate snakes, but as long as they can coexist with them. And we have people who are terrified of snakes that like will see one of our snake shirts and be like, that's amazing. So that's kind of one way that you can help snakes, is just by wearing one of our shirts and getting some like conversations started.
Great. We'll put the we'll put the website link in the show notes for the episode. So I'd encourage everybody to go check out the website, buy a t-shirt, make a donation, whatever you can do. Just like Michael said, $5, $100, whatever it is. But great mission, great cause. So encourage everybody to go out and do their part. So we've been going about an hour now, Michael. So we'll begin to take this episode in for a landing. But before we do that, is there like one key thing about Save the Snakes that you really wanted to mention that you didn't have the opportunity to in the conversation we had?
Yeah, if I was to sum up something, I think a big take home message for me is that, well, this, not to get too dark, but there are some dark times ahead. In terms of, so we're very aware of climate change issues and some increasing problems that our global society is going to be facing. And so I'll give you a perfect example. So some of the researchers that we work with are studying climate change in venomous snakes, and the distribution of venomous snakes will change. And so people will be experiencing snakes where there weren't snakes. And at the same time as that happening, where, some venomous snakes will be doing better and thus causing more problems for people, certain other venomous snake species are actually going to be really hindered by climate change in terms of, living in certain environments that are getting shrinking. So I think it's really important that if you love snakes, you love these animals, because I know so many in your audience do, support nonprofits that are working on snake conservation, because many of us are starting to look at those things so that we can help save these species and help people coexist with them. And, you can do that in many ways. Volunteers, donate, but just by being aware of what these organizations are doing is so critically important, because saving snakes, snakes are important. Let's save them together.
Completely agree. Well, Michael, I like to have each of my guests imagine maybe that, let's just say you and I are in Nepal and we've just had a long day out looking for king cobras or what have you. And we're sitting around a campfire at night. And I turn to you and ask you to tell me your best snake story.
So I feel very privileged to have seen some amazing snakes around the world, but not to be cliche, but the first time I saw a king cobra in the wild was incredible. That is truly a remarkable animal. But so our team was filming a little mini documentary for a project we were supporting in the Western Ghats of India. So we were filming a long-term conservation project out of the Gumbe Rainforest Reserve. And these researchers had been working with king cobras for decades and getting the community around this area to actually love these animals and to want to protect them. But I remember walking up to the research after a long day of travel, to walking up to the center and, kind of entering their little meeting area where they have their dinners and stuff. And they have this long table, and stretched out on the table is a 15-foot long king cobra that's been anesthetized, and they're installing a transmitter in it. And so for me and my team to just walk up and hopefully get to see king cobras, and there's a snake that is going to be released out in the wild. And so it was a snake a large male, 15 feet long. It had been rescued from a home, and it was a perfect candidate to go and study, and they had a transmitter. So for a day, the snake recovered. We actually have a photo in our office of the snake in its box recovering. But then we tracked it for 2 days and watched it, move through the ecosystem. And, many people might think when you're tracking wildlife, if you got like a collar on a lion or a bear, you're far away, right? Not with snakes. You're right on top of them. And so, because otherwise you lose them. And so this snake, they just cruise the forest, and they are big, they're bold. This is their realm. They are truly like an apex predator in that forest. And basically the snake wanted nothing to do with us. We were about, maybe 15 feet behind it trying to keep up. But then every now and then it would turn, because it would basically be following the scent of a snake, because that's what it's out looking to get. It would turn and then just beeline towards us, and not meant to come towards us, like to attack us or anything, but just because, the scent changed and it's off chasing some other venomous snake. And so the individual who's tracking the snake, and we're lucky to tag along, is just like, whenever it does that, you have to stay put and not move, because when you move, that's when it becomes offensive. And so to have a 15-foot king cobra, its body is, thick as my leg, and to just resist all urge to flee when it starts moving towards you, it makes you humble, it makes you small. And I think many people in the world should feel that way, because you remember your place in the environment. But then just to watch the snake pass on and just, it's like, live long and let's help save you, because you are truly a remarkable thing on our planet.
That's great. I think that's a great way to close it. Great story. Michael, again, I appreciate you coming on today. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Hey, it was such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Great. And I just wanted to thank the audience and tell everybody to remember, snakes are animals too, and it's a privilege to see one in the wild.